Hello, this is Randy with Excel for Freelancers, and welcome to the Multi-Page Invoices. We've created many invoices before, but always a single page. What if we want to create an invoice with hundreds, or maybe even thousands of items? We don't want to create any ugly invoice. So how can we create an incredible, beautiful, and professional multi-page invoices very easily in Excel? I'm going to show you all that and a whole lot more in this week's training. I hope you'll stick with us. So let's get started. All right, thank you so much for joining us today. I've got a really fantastic training and also one of them that's been highly requested because we've always in the past created a single page invoice. And of course, in Excel, it's a little bit more complicated because if we've got a lot of items like this, how are we going to put headers and footers on? How are we going to make it look professional? We're going to take care of all that today. I want to get you a really professional invoices. Take a look at this. This is when it's been printed out. We've got a page number at the bottom. We've got a consistent header at the top, and we've got a professional footer at the bottom of the last page of the invoice, right? I want something that we can design fully dynamic. So a single click, it's going to print no matter what, even if we have a single automated. So we can continually adding items to our invoice. And of course, when we add more items, we want those reflected. We of course want our summary reflected, and just one click we'll be able to print. Or of course, if we want to create a PDF, saving it as a PDF is going to work just fine. As you'll see here in the PDF, we now have our new items. We've got 3 pages of PDFs here, and we've got a very, very professional invoices with a consistent header on every single page and a footer with a summary on the last page. So we're going to go over all that and how to do that, and that's going to be coming up right now. So I cannot wait. I just ask a few things from you. Of course, I don't ask for too much, and I try not to always. I want to make these trainings available for you each and every Tuesday. So if you could, go ahead and hit that subscribe button below, and don't forget that notification icon bell. That'll ensure that you get these trainings alerted each and every week. Your comments really help because I want to hear from each and every one of you. I respond to each and every comment every single week. So that's really going to help us. And don't forget to smash that like button. All right, that'll help for the YouTube algorithms. I am going to have a huge announcement this week, and that means our 250 workbook pack is now available. That's 250 of my best templates now available for download, and that means you can get every single one of my workbooks, and along with an incredible library that's going to allow you a single click to open the workbook and a single click to view the corresponding YouTube training video. And that's all inside the workbook library available. If you have already purchased a previous one, perhaps the 200 to 150, I'll include a special upgrade. Go ahead and email us down below, right? Randy@excelforfreelancers.com, and I'll make sure to get you an upgraded price if you've purchased before. Just let us know the email that you've purchased on before. All right, great. So that's it. We've got that. This is going to be a fantastic training. As I mentioned before, we have created invoices in the past, even from scratch, right? If you are new to VBA, right, and you want to see it, I'll include the link down below for that invoice from scratch to help you out. Also, if you are new to VBA and want to learn VBA from the ground up, my mentor, Daniel Strong, has an incredible VBA course. It's going to teach you every aspect of VBA, and that'll get you all set up for my trainings as well here, because we don't necessarily go into the basics all the time. All right, so that's Daniel Strong's. I'll include the link down below for that as well. Let's get started on this training because I've got so much to share with you. We'll go over the basics. We'll cover every conditional formatting, every format, every function, and of course, every formula in this training. I'll go step by step. Sometimes I do like to create trainings from scratch when they get a little bit more complex. Then we go ahead and take over that, and we go over every line of code and everything that I've already done. And then ensures that these trainings are anywhere between usually 90 minutes and 2 hours, right? They are long, and of course, I try to deliver as much value as possible. So I appreciate your shares, likes, comments, and all of that. All right, so what do we have here? Well, we've got a basic invoice here. I want to be able to search for an invoice if I've previously created it. I want to search for that invoice. If I want to enter that invoice number, I want that previously saved invoice number to load up. I want to set a footer message. Footer message can be a thank you, and I'll show you what that's going to look like in just a moment. I want to have a subtotal up at the top. That way, if we add items, we always have a subtotal, a tax, and a total of that invoice. I want to be able to save and update that invoice. And I want to have a fade out message when I save that so they'll let the user know that it has been saved. I want to be able to create a brand new invoice that clears everything out and allows us to start entering items very, very easily. Okay, those items I also want to be able to print the invoice out. It's going to print to that default printer, and you're going to notice something come up here, and we'll go over that in just a moment. And that's going to print whatever invoice you've created on the screen. So that'll print it to the default printer. Mine is Snagit. So whatever printer you have. And if it's a single page, which is kind of nice, let's go over that, take a look at that. If it's a single page, it's going to show the footer at the bottom. However, if it is a multi-page, that footer is going to be on the last page. So if we were to print this out, as you saw before on my printer here, you can see this one's been printed to the last page on this one, our page 3 of 3. If we zoom in here, page 3 of 3, the footer is going to be on the last page. It's always going to be the last item regardless of how many pages are on there. So we'll be able to save it. We'll be able to delete the invoice. And then, of course, we're also going to be able to add a customer. So if we want to add a customer, we just click on the button here and we can add a customer in. Okay, we can create new customers, right? Or we can select from existing customers if we want to load. When we select from an existing customer, we want the customer's address to auto-populate. Okay, let's take a look inside here. Now, when invoices are saved, we have a list of invoices. I just have 2 invoices saved here. I'll make sure to get that total populating. But I want to make sure that we are saving those. And I also need the individual items for those invoices. Notice we just have invoice 1. We have the individual items saved here. So we have invoice item 1. We've got the item name. So all of these are saved for invoice ID number 1. Here is the item name. Here's the item description. Here's the quantity, what was used. And then here is whether the amount of that, whether it's been taxed or not, the row that's associated with the invoice. So this is on the invoice row number 9, 10, 11. And what does that mean? That means it's going to correspond to row number 9, 10, or 11. So when the invoice items get loaded back, we know exactly what row to place them on. Also, on saying the invoice items, we want to know the row. I want to know the database row that's associated with that. And I'll go over that exactly why that's important. Because if I make a change here, I need to know what database row is saved. And that database row is going to be corresponding to right here in column. So that means when we have a new invoice, this is going to get it all cleared out. If I decide to add an item, there's no database row associated with that because it has not been saved yet. Right? As soon as I save and update this, it's going to assign a specific row. We need to add a customer first. Let's go ahead and do that. That's a good required field. Saving and updating that, we're going to put rows now 111, 112, and 113 for these 3 different items. If we look into the down here on the bottom of our table here, we now have on invoice number 3, the one we just created, we have those 3 items on rows of 111, 112, and 113. Now the corresponding invoice rows is 9, 10, and 11, corresponding here to the rows 9, 10, and 11. Great, and we also have the totals here. So we're going to go over that and see exactly how we do that. So invoice items are kept for every specific invoice. If we want to be able to see the top, all we need to do is just freeze that, right? We can go into there and then just freeze the panes right here and freeze the panes. Okay, so now what we can see that as we scroll down, we can see it. We also have the tax item. Now this is the tax item. We're saying, well, why is this U with the dots? Well, that's actually the check box. So if we were going to change this font to Wingdings, we would see that it is the checkbox. And we don't necessarily need it in that specific font in our database, but we certainly need it in our invoice, right? I want to be able to select and unselect and add tax as I wish if the item is going to be taxed or not, right? And notice that the taxed amount is going to change here, right? So as we unselect, add taxes or subtract, those are going to be reflected here. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do that, right? So we need to save that and we need to load it. If an item is going to be taxed or not, I'm going to save and update that. When I load in, let's go ahead and load number 2 and then back to number 3 again, the one that we were just working on. I want to make sure that that tax status gets saved in the database. That's why it is saved here. So if we go all the way down to the bottom here, we see that we mark this item as not taxed, and therefore it is that U with the 2 dots or umlaut is not going to show up. All right, so we've got that there for that. And also what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're going to have totals. We also have a list of customers here. A list of customers, simply the customers. We need to have a customer name, and we want those addresses to load in when we change the customer, so it's important to keep that customer information. And also we have some items, just a list of items. We have a basically item name, a description, the default quantity that we want to show up on an invoice when that item is selected, the price of it, and whether the item is taxable or not. And that way, if we decide to put in hourly labor, which is not taxable, and I want to put that in here, and I select from the hourly labor here, and I'm going to make sure that that default is not taxed. However, if we change that tax status here, then we copy this and paste it down here. I guess I could add a selection change on that. When I decide I'm going to add it in again, double clicking on that, it's now going to be taxed. So it's going to take on the defaults of whatever was set up, whether it is taxable or not, inside from its original list. We'll go over that as well. Okay, so back into the invoice. So we see that we're creating these items and we're adding to the invoice and we're saving them. That is it for all the databases. Relatively simple. Remember, we're keeping track of all the invoices, the individual items that go into the invoices, our customers, and our items. And in our admin screen, just some basic information here. I want to know the status of some invoices, whether it's been paid or open. That's just something that we can mark on inside. I want to know what the default status is. For example, if I select here, and that means when I want to have a new invoice, I want those new invoices to be automatically marked as unpaid. So when I go into here and I say new invoice, I want this status to change as unpaid. However, if I were to switch it to open here, and I go back into the invoice and I click new invoice one more time, that new invoice is going to be set to open. So that is the default status for our new invoices. Likewise, I want to have some payment terms, right? If I want to set some payment terms based on the invoice, I want those payment terms to help me determine the due date. So if I know that we have a net 30 and the invoice date was 5/18, I know it's going to be due on 6/17. Now, if I change that to net 15, I want that due date automatically to set to different. Likewise, if I were to change the date of the invoice date and it is based on net 15, I also want the due on to change. So we have that as well. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and load up an invoice with a lot of items, right? So we also want to make sure we load up that. So also in the admin screen, we want to set that default. New invoices, I want to be able to set a default. So if we have a due on receipt and then I check new invoice, I want to make sure that that due on receipt is set here in the terms. And I also want to make sure that in due on is the same date as the invoice date, right? It's all based on the number of days we set, right? So if we were to add one and we said net 90, right? And we said that's going to be 90 days from the invoice date. And we decided to set that as the default. When I click new invoice, it's going to take that current date, May 18th. We're going to add on 3 months, 90 days to that. And it's going to set it to August 16th. So that's how we're going to do it for new ones, okay? So it's very, very flexible, very easy. I want to know if we're going to be charging sales tax or not, right? If we decide that we're not going to charge sales tax and we want to invoice it, we see that our total, I'll update that. Let's go ahead and put in some new invoices. I want to make sure that that gets reflected automatically. And let's go ahead and make sure an update. I want to make sure that that is reflected. Let's take a look at that. This is called tax option. This is a named range called tax option. If that's equal to no, I want to make sure that we're not showing anything. So I'm going to add that in right now. If tax option equals, like that, let's put equals, in this case, no, right? What do we want to show? I just want a 0. I will zero that out. Otherwise, I want to sum the total rate. I'm going to end the parentheses here. Okay, that's exactly what I want to see. Now, if we were to change that back to yes, then I want that whatever tax default rate, it's called tax rate. This is a named range called tax rate. I want to use that tax rate and multiply that. So now we've changed it to yes, and we see that the tax is now reflected in here. If we were to change that percentage to 5%, we would then see that that new total is reflected here. And that's in a formula based on here. We're simply going to sum all based on, we're going to use a sum if. I want to know all of the rows in which this is not empty, meaning column I is not empty. If we know it's empty, it's not going to be taxed. If it is not empty, we are going to make sure it's taxed, right? If it's got that check mark, we're going to be taxing it. Otherwise, don't tax it. And if it is checked, we are going to simply sum whatever's in column H, and we're going to multiply that times the tax rate. So let's pull up a larger one with some more items. So we see that we are now taxing everything with a check mark based on this particular rate. So that's all we need to do it. And now the subtotal above is simply the sum of whatever's in H9. So also, if you notice that this text here went also to nothing, when I changed that to no, we're going to show blank, right? That's what I want to happen. I want this field to show blank. So if the tax option equals no, show nothing, right? Empty space. Otherwise, show tax. And then what I want to do is I want to show the tax rate. But I don't just want to show that specific tax rate. I want to actually show a formatted version of that tax rate. So I want to show it formatted based on this format here. We can wrap that around text. That's going to format. The text command is going to format it. It's going to format that value, and it's going to be formatted based on the percentage. So that is how, as soon as we mark that to yes, that is how we get that tax percentage. And we also get it formatted the way that we want to. So we know the tax is 5%. Great. And we know the amount of the tax in this case is $988 based on that tax rate. And we have a total of $21,054. Now the total is simply the subtotal plus the tax. Okay, this is really important. We also have a footer message. We'll be going over that in just a bit later. Great. But the footer message inside the admin, they come from here, right? So if I have a footer message here and I've got different footer messages, I can create a footer message. Now the footer message, the long text form is here, and I've got some named range to help us with that. So if we go into the formulas, and we go into the name manager, and we take a look at something called footer name. Well, this is a dynamic named range based on the 3 items that we have here. As our footer messages grow, so will our named range. And I've got the same thing in the footer message, except this is for the footer message in column L. As you can see, it's also based on that. And as we're going to count basically based on J, which is the footer message names, we're going to count those, and we're going to set it to K, and that's going to count all the ones in column K. And that way it's going to help us out because I want that footer message displayed inside the footer. Where do I want that displayed? I want it displayed inside a footer. Let's take a look at what that would look like inside our footer, and it's going to be right here. So if we take a look and we zoom in here, we see that we have in a printed version save 30%. So our footer message is going to go in a box. Then we have our subtotal, our tax, and our total inside our footer, which is exactly where we want it. Okay, but of course, I want to get those displayed inside the invoice, those footer messages. So if we take a look inside our invoice here, and I've got some information down here. Our footer message is actually going to be displayed right here. That is going to be linked to our footer. We'll get into how it's linked. But basically what I want to do is I want the user to be able to select whatever footer message they want, and then the footer message name, and then I want that entire footer message to show up here. If we expand that, we see that our entire footer message is saved here. We don't need it expanded in this, but what we want to do is we want to look it up. So what we're going to do is we're going to index that footer message, right? And I want to run a match. I want to know what row it's located on. So to do that, we're going to run a match based on the footer name in K2. And we want an exact match. We're looking up on that footer message column, that column for the footer message. If there's an error, we're going to return nothing. So what that's going to do is use index and match to determine exactly our footer message. So our footer message is going to go here. It, of course, will be linked to a shape that will allow us to show that. A few other things inside this. We understand the item database row. We went over that. I want to know the row associated with a customer. If the user enters a brand new name, I want to make sure that this customer row goes to blank, and we get an opportunity to add that customer. If we say yes, I want to be able to add that customer inside here. So if not, I just want to select from a customer here. But I want to know the row that's associated. I have a named range for the customers. If we go into the formulas and the name manager, we take a look at the customer name and we tab over here. We see again, we have another dynamic named range using offset based on all the customer names here. So I've got one. So that way we can know if the user enters one of the names, I'm going to know what's row associated with that. And our first one starts on row 3. So that way inside the invoice, I want to add 2 because I know the first one found is going to be on row 3 and I want the row that's associated with that customer. To do that, we're going to run that match based on what's in E4. And we're going to match the customer names. And we want an exact match, and we're adding 2. If there's an error, we're going to show blank. That way we can run a simple test. We know if this is blank, the customer has not been entered yet. We also want to know the invoice row. I want to know, basically, is there a row that's associated with this invoice number? If we have a new invoice, invoice number 4 inside H1 has not been saved yet. If we take a look inside the invoice list, I've got a named range called invoice ID. If we go into the formulas, name manager, and invoice ID, we see again we have a name using offset, a dynamic named range, and you see 4 is not in there. So if it's not going to be found, I'm going to show blank. And let's take a look inside that formula. That formula here, again, if error, we're going to match, we're looking whatever's in H1 for the invoice ID. I'm looking for that. 4 is not there. It's going to create an error and it's going to return empty space. And that's how I can differentiate between a brand new invoice or an existing invoice. If we load an existing invoice, we know that H11 is in there, and we also know that it's associated with row 3. We're adding to, it's the first one found, we're adding to, and that's going to associate with row 3. Great, but I also want to be able to search a row, right? If I'm going to be searching here for a specific invoice, I need to know, again, using the same formula, that match, except this time we're going to be looking in K1. I'm looking for whatever invoice the user enters. It happens very fast, but I'm going to enter here. That's going to return a result here. If it returns a correct row here, the macro is going to simply take that particular invoice number that the user entered, and it's going to place it directly inside H1. Once that's done, the macro is going to then load all the items in here. Then it's going to clear out. It's been cleared out. That's why this is going to return 0, because this has been cleared out. Great. So I also want to know the next invoice number. We have a named range for invoices, as you saw, and we're going to use the max formula. It's going to be the invoice ID plus 1. So I want to know the maximum of all the invoice IDs, which is 3, plus 1, which is 4. If there's no data at all, it's going to create an error. Therefore, we're just going to set the default to 1. All right, I also want to differentiate between loading an invoice and not loading. In other words, when I load an invoice, there's some changes to here, there's some changes to here, right? Everything gets changed when I load it because it's the previous, whatever's been saved. So I want to differentiate between that type of change where we're loading values, where I'm loading the terms, or I'm loading the due date, or I'm loading the invoice date, as opposed to the user actually making a change. Because if the user makes a change, then I want to make sure that we change the due on date, right? So when we load that, I want to make sure that everything gets changed based on that. So I need to differentiate between changes where user makes and changes that come from the macro, in which is going to be loading the previously saved values. And we'll update that total there inside the macro once we get to it, because I want to make sure that G populates the total. Okay. Great. So I also want to, so that's why we're going to set this. So that means when this invoice loads, we're going to set this to true, then we're going to set it back to false. Okay, so that's it. That's all the formulas here that we have. Now we have some conditional formatting. Now traditionally, let's put in a number, let's say 2, okay? So traditionally, I want to highlight alternate rows. But in this case, I want to put a little bit of a different color on the next row down, and that prompts the user to enter that so that the user can quickly see that they can enter items very, very easily because they have that next available space. So it's very easy and very intuitive for the user to then enter that items there. So how are we going to do that? Well, that's with conditional formatting. And basically all I want to do is I want to check the row above. If the row above is not empty, then I want to color the line below. So how are we going to do that? Well, I'm going to go into home, then we're going to go into conditional formatting, and we're going to manage those rules. And we're going to see we have basically 2 rules. One's for even rows and one's for odd rows. So for the even rows, there's 2 conditions, right? I want to make sure that D8, keep in mind D8 is not empty and the mod row is equal to 0, meaning it's an even row. Then I want to do applies to D9. Now, normally when we use conditional formatting for alternate rows, we want to make sure that this row, D8, and the applies to would always be the same. But in this case in particular, I want to color the line below, right? So that way the line above we're checking, right? If it applies to 9, we're checking the above row. And that means when I have a new invoice, let's close out of that. When I have a new invoice, notice how that first line is colored, right? Again, D8 contains a value. So we're going to make sure that the 9 that applies to gets colored, right? So that's a very, very easy way that we can do that, right? So let's go show you another example here. Okay, so I want to make sure that we do that. So the odd and even rows get colored based on that. So it's very, very important because we're applying it to the row below, So the row below is D9. And the row above is where the formulas are. So that's how we apply it to the row below, the one that doesn't include data. Okay, so that's it for the conditional formatting on this portion of it. Okay, great. So we've been over that. So now what we want to do is I want to make sure that when we save it or update it, we're going to go over some macros here. Now, the key thing here is we want to make sure that when we're saving it, we want to print it out accordingly so that we can do that. And we're going to get into just that in just a moment. I want to go over some of the basics for you before we get into the print, just so we understand exactly what's going on when we save it and when we click new. Okay, so we're just going to go over the save and new. All right, now the adding the customer portion, we're also going to go over briefly so we can do that as well. But first, I'd like to demonstrate some of the actions that you've already seen. You notice that when we change the invoice date, the due date automatically changed, and it changed based on the terms selected. So if I were to change this to 12/15, we see that this is automatically going to change. So let's figure out and see exactly how that's going to happen. Well, that happens, of course, when we make a worksheet change, but only the kind of change when this is false, right? When the invoice loads, when I load an invoice, I don't want to make any changes to here. I only want to bring whatever was saved in the database. So how are we going to do that? Well, that's going to happen on worksheet change. So we're going to do that inside VBA. Developer, Visual Basic, Alt F11 will get you there. And we're going to focus on our invoice, right? Our invoice. This is where the macros happen. And we're going to focus all the way at the top on worksheet change. When I make a change to a worksheet, something is going to happen, right? We're going to get into customer name in just a moment, but we're going to focus right now on the invoice date or terms, but not on invoice load. That means when we make a change to the invoice date, or when we make a change to the terms, but not on the invoice load. What do I mean by that? On invoice date, H3. On terms, H5, but not when only when B5 equals only when B6 equals false. So those are the conditions that we want. On intersection, not intersect, target, range, H3 and H5. And that means when we make a change to H3 or H5 directly on this invoice sheet, nothing. And of course, B6 must equal false. This means not on invoice load. You'll see when we run the macro, just very briefly, when I run a macro called invoice load, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set B6 to true, right? B6 to true, and then it's going to go back to false before it ends. So we know that that's going to happen on invoice load. Okay, we'll go over that in just a moment. So we want to make sure that B6 is false. So nothing happens when the invoice is loading. The changes that are made to H3 and H5 won't happen here when it's loading, only when it's not loading. Okay, first of all, I want to make sure that we have to have values. If we're going to calculate the due on date, which is exactly what I want to calculate, I need to make sure that we have two things. We must have an invoice date and we must have terms. If either one of those are empty, then we cannot calculate the due on date. So we're going to check for both of those required fields. If H3 value equals empty or H5 value equals empty, then we're going to exit the sub. Both of those have to be filled in order for us to properly calculate that due date. Okay, so we're going to mention the payment term as a string and the payment row as long, right? I need to calculate those. That payment term is going to be whatever's in H5. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to determine the payment row. I need to know what row that payment term is located on. If I take a look at all the payment terms here, all the way from F5 through F23, or using our named range payment terms, I want to know what row is it on. Is it row 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10, right? I want to know what row. When I know what row is on, I can determine the number of days because that's in column G and whatever row it is. So we need to extract that. So how are we going to do that? Well, with a payment row is going to be equal to the admin, right? Range terms. We have a named range called terms, right? Just to double check to make sure we understand. Formulas, name manager, going into something called terms. Again, this is basically another dynamic named range based on the offset formula. So I'm looking inside that named range. You see the dancing answer on? I'm looking for that term using the find command. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that payment term using find. And I want Excel values and Excel whole, and I want to extract the row. Now, if it's not found, it would return the bug. So I certainly want to wrap that in on error resume next and on error go to 0. Then I simply have to test to see if it was found. If it wasn't found, payment row is going to be 0. So we can run a check here. If the payment row does not equal 0, then I want to calculate that invoice due date is located in H6. That invoice due date is right here inside H6. So that's going to be equal to what? It's going to be equal to whatever's in H4 plus whatever's in the row and column G, wherever it's found, it's going to be right here. So again, it's going to be H3, our invoice date, plus column G and the payment row. The payment row has already been determined. That's going to set our due date automatically based on that. Very good. So we see how that we can make a change to either one of these, and it's automatically going to set the due date based on the number it's found. Okay, cool. We saw another worksheet change where we make a change to the customer and automatically the address, the city, the zip automatically adds. So how are we going to do that, right? Well, it's going to come directly from here. It's going to come directly from here. We need to make a quick update on that, if it's available. And what I want to do is I want to show the address. I want to show the city, state, and zip and I want to bring it all into here. So how are we going to do that? In fact, I think it's missing the state. We're going to fix that up. I don't think it's showing all the values. Oh, there it is. Okay, so we do have it there on this to make sure that we're showing everyone. All right, good. Yeah, that looks correct. So how do we do that? Well, that's, of course, going to be on change of E4. Now, in this case, in this particular case, regardless of whether we are loading an invoice, I want that address to load up, regardless of whether we're loading an invoice or whether users actually making a change. So it's not going to be effective. It's going to happen either when we load the invoice or when they user makes a change. So that's why we don't necessarily need, in this case, when B6 is false. So what kind of change is that? Well, that's going to be a change to E4. When any change to E4 happens, that's when I want to check for it. Okay, so that's going to be all the way up here on customer name change. E4, right? And I want to make sure E4 is not empty, right? If it's empty, we're going to do something else, right? So first we're going to dimension the customer row. Remember, we need to have that customer row located in B2. If B2 is empty, we know it's a new customer. So if B2 does not equal empty, that means it's an existing customer. We're going to determine that customer row based on that B2 value. That is our customer row. Okay, and that's the row that's been saved inside the customer. That is the row that's associated directly right here. So if I know the row, then I can extract the address in column C, and then D, E, and F are going to take on both the city, state, and the zip code. So once I know that row, I can bring it up here. So once I know the row, E5 is going to take on the address, which is in column C. We know that E6 is going to take on, again, the city here in column D, the state here in column E, and the zip code in column F. It's going to take all of that on. Okay, that's all we need to do. And we're going to combine all of that into E6, except we're going to add a spacer between the city and the zip. And we're going to add a comma and a space between the city and the zip, and of course the address here. And the city, actually a city and the state takes on a spacer, while the state and the zip takes on a comma and the space. Okay, but what if the customer is not found? If the customer is not found, we want something else to happen, right? If I make a change here and I want to put in a Jackie, right? And I want to put in the customer is not found. Would you like to add them, right? So something different is going to happen. If I click yes, I want that customer name to be launched in our user form. So how do we do that? Well, here, else customer not found, we're going to clear out any addresses. That means I'm going to clear out both whatever's located in E5 and E6. I want to clear that out. Next up, what I want to do is I want to create a message box, and then we're going to use it as an option box. So if this customer does not exist, would you like to add them? If VB customer not found, if it's yes, then what we're going to do is we're going to launch our add customer form. This is our user form that we've already created. It's called add customer form. And I have a field here, and that field is called field 1. So I want to take whatever the value is, whatever the user has entered directly inside E4, and I want to place that directly inside our user form as a value. That gives us the default name to start with. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do that right here. So add customer form, field 1, value equals whatever's in E4. This is going to set that default customer name. Then I want to display that form using this. So this is going to display that customer form, display customer user form. Great. So we have that there, and that's all we need to do. So great. So what about on search change, right? We've covered on customer name change. We've covered on invoice date or term change, but we haven't covered on invoice number change. And remember, that's going to be the one when the user actually makes a search, right? When I search for the invoice, that's a change to K1. When something happens, what I want to do, I want to check to see if B4 contains a value. If it does contain a row, then what I want to do is I want to take whatever they've entered, I want to put it inside H1, and then I want to run a macro to load it. So that's just what we're going to do. On any change of K1, and I want to make sure K1 is not empty, then I'm going to check B4. If they enter an incorrect invoice, if I enter incorrect, here, I want to be able to say, please make sure to enter a correct invoice number. That would be for an incorrect invoice number. So that would mean B4 would be empty on an incorrect invoice number. I want to let the user know, please make sure to enter a correct invoice number. And then we're going to exit the sub, right? Otherwise, right, if it is correct, then what we're going to do is we're going to take whatever invoice number in K1 the user entered, we're going to place it directly in H1, and then we can clear the contents of K1. Now keep this in mind. We must have this. When I make a change to K1, right, and we're already inside a loop, If I don't include this, this is going to create a loop and it's going to crash your system. That's what happens. Sometimes you get crashes, you don't know why. I can create a crash right now. Why is that going to happen? Because one, we've made a change here to K1. It's going to say, oh, you made a change to K1. I'm going to continue on. It's going to continue and keep looping or looping and looping around. But as long as we say K1 does not equal empty, here we're making K1 empty, but it's only going to go into this loop if K1 is not equal empty. So we can do that, right? So keep it in mind. That's a very easy way to create system crashes. Usually when you have a crash, right, for no reason, it is because of some type of loop, like on selection change, or some type of loop on here worksheet change, because we've created a loop. So that can happen, a loop that you can't get out of. So keep that in mind. And then I want to run the macro, which we're going to go over in just a moment, called invoice load. So once we know we've got a correct invoice number, we can then run that macro, invoice load. Okay, great. So we've done a little bit. Now let's continue on with this on item name change, but not on invoice load. Now there's the last item. When I make a change, let's pull up an invoice that we can, when I make a change here to D, all right, anything column D9 all the way on down, and I want to make sure to load in those items. Or the kind of change, if I decide I'm going to delete it, I want to make sure to clear that item using the delete key. So there's going to be this type of change. So this type of change. But I also, again, I only want to make this kind of change. I only want to put in, for example, if I put in 2 here, I want to make sure that that gets saved, right? The type of change, there's 2 types of changes. One when the user is entering items, and another type when we're actually loading that. So we need to differentiate between those 2 types of changes. So again, I really only want to focus on the type of change when the user is actually making a physical entry of adding or removing an item. And we know that difference because we know that B6 is going to be false. Then we can load the item. So that's what we're going to do. If the user makes a change anywhere from D9 all the way to D999 and B6 equals false, meaning the invoice is not being loaded, then we want to continue. I'm going to turn off application screen updating false just temporarily to make things a little bit quicker, although it may not be necessary, but I'm going to show you a few things that help speed up your application. All right, I also want to make sure that if D in the target row, meaning the target, the value that the user just entered, if it's empty, we're going to do something else. If it's not empty, we're going to do something. So this is what we're going to do if it's not empty. We're going to dimension the item row is long. I need to know what row is associated. If I enter a specific item here, I need to know what row that 𝐃𝐿 is on. I need to know that it is row 6. I need to be found it because then I need to find it because I need to make sure that we're going to enter that item description. I need to enter the default quantity, and I need to enter the price that's associated with it, as well as if it's taxable or not. And I need to make sure that all that gets entered here into the description, quantity, amount. I also need to enter a formula, right? Notice the formulas are only in lines that contain values. That's what I want. I want to speed the application. I don't want to put in formulas where they're not needed. And the taxable status, or if it's not taxable. I don't want to be able to make it untaxable or taxable just by selecting on it. Great, so how are we going to do that? Well, let's continue with the code, right? So I need to determine the item row. So again, we're going to use the find command. I've got named range called item name. This is an offset named range right inside our formulas here. We'll take a look at just this one, even if we didn't do it before. Named range, item name here. It's just basically a dynamic name range based on our item name. So let's take a look in here and tab it over, and we see that it's all of our item names based on that item. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to look inside this named range, and I want to find that item name, and I want to extract the row from it if it's found, right? If it's not found, it could create an error, so we need to run a test. That's why we're wrapping it. Anytime we use find, we really want to make sure do we wrap it in on error resume next, and on error goes 0, and then we just need to run a test if the item row does not equal 0, and that means the item has been found. Okay, if it's been found, then we can do the following, all right? All we need to do is take the item description from column B in the items database here, and then place it in column E. We're going to take the default quantity from column C in the items and place it in F. Likewise, the cost is going to go in G. Then we're going to put in that formula, right? I want that formula here. I don't want to place that formula, right? I want to be able to clear everything out, including the formulas. And if I decide to load it, right, I want the formulas to go back in here. Or if I decide to add an item, there's no formula in here. If I add an item, I want only then do I want that formula to appear, because I don't like formulas that we're not using. So what I want to do is I want to place that formula using VBA. So we can do that here. h in the target row dot formula, could be dot value as well, it's fine, equals, and then we can say equals f and the target row times g in the target row, and that's simply going to enter this formula here, f12 times g12. That's it. That's all we have to do to enter that formula, and that way we have live calculations. If the user decide they're going to change the quantity, we know that that total is going to update automatically. And then the last line of code, we just want to make sure column I takes on the taxable status, and that's going to come directly from column E inside the code. So I in the target row is going to take on whatever's in E in the item row, the taxable status. Okay, all of that is if it is not empty, but what if the user, it is empty? When it is empty, the user will simply just be deleting an item. What do we want to happen now? Well, in that case, I want to make sure that we're deleting everything in that line item. Okay, so to do that, we can do else here, deleted item, clear the row. So E through I, we're going to clear the contents out. I also want to know if the database row exists, right? If I decide to delete this, I need to make sure that we are going to delete it inside the database. Notice it was 110, right? I want to make sure to delete it inside the database as well. So we save and update it, and we decide to load invoice number 2. I want to make sure that that item doesn't load anymore, right? Notice it didn't load. So we need to make sure to clear it also in the database as well. So to do that, we're going to check. I'm going to dimension the invoice item database as long, and that we're going to take whatever's in B is going to take on that variable. That is our database row, our invoice item database row. Okay, so now we got that. So what I want to do is I want to delete that inside the invoice items database. We're going to delete that entire row using invoice item database and the colon and entire row delete. So that's going to delete the database row. I also want to make sure that we're clearing out whatever was in B, clearing out there. So we're clearing out that row, what's in it here. Then it's also deleted from the database. Okay, very good. And we're going to turn on application screen updating to true to make sure we've turned it off, just to make sure things are faster. Okay, great. So that's it for the worksheet change event. So we've covered also on customer name change, on invoice search change, on an invoice date or terms change, and on item name change. So all that happens. However, we saw one more thing inside on the sheet, and that was when we make an item taxable or non-taxable. We want to make that selection. So how are we going to do that? Well, that's based on selection change, on a selection change. In fact, I may want to do one more thing. Notice if I want to make it taxable and untaxable, I have to select something else. So we can do that inside the code as well. I'm going to add that in. So when we make a selection change to I9 through I99, and I want to make sure that D doesn't contain empty, right? That means if I select something here, nothing's going to happen because column D is empty, right? Only on those items where column D contains a value, that's when I want something to happen, right? If the target value equals empty, then I want to add in that check mark. That check mark is character 252 inside the Wingdings font. How do we know that? If I select here and I want to insert a symbol here and I want to click symbol, we see that the check mark here, this particular one, is character code 252. Whoops, here it is. Character 252, right? So we know the character code. Inside VBA, that's going to enter that character right there. So then the target value equals 252, else the target is clear the contents. And that means if we select on something that has a value already, we're going to clear it. If we select on nothing, clear it. Now notice that I had to select away and select back again. That's kind of annoying. But what we can do to get rid of that is select another cell using VBA, and I'll select D in the target row. So all we have to do is just add in one line of code, range D and the target dot row dot select. Okay, so that's going to select something else. Now I can select the same cell twice. Notice I can select as many times as we want because D gets automatically selected. Okay, so that's kind of an easy way to quickly select and unselect. So if I select here, select and select, so I can keep doing the same cell again and again. Okay, great. So that's all that happens on the selection change event. That's the only code. Everything else is right. Okay, great. So let's take a look. We saw a few macros. Now I've got two modules here. One, we're going to focus on the invoice macros, and that's going to be invoice save, invoice load, invoice new, and the other is associated with the print macros. Okay, so let's go over the invoice macros where we're going to save them. Now it's up here. Now I've dimensioned some variables up here, and we're going to go over them as we go over inside the invoice. The first thing I have to do here, I'm going to go over this in just a little bit. I'm going to skip this for now, right? Because I want to explain why we're doing that. And it's going to go into a little detail as we create them. So basically we're removing some shapes here, and I'll go over why we're doing that because we're going to do this exact code a few times so I can go over it again. Okay, so the first thing is the second thing is, first thing is removing these shapes, and we'll go over why. E5 is empty, right? I need to know if we're going to save or update this particular macro is the same exact macro that's applied to this button. This is the macro that's going to run whether we're saving a brand new invoice or whether we're updating an existing invoice. So we're going to run that. Our fade out message is going to happen, and it's going to automatically save that invoice. So it's also going to update it, right? But what do I need to determine is it a new invoice or is it an existing invoice? And we can look here inside the invoice row of B3. That's going to let us know whether it is new or existing. So if it is a new invoice, we know that B3 is going to be empty, right? If it's an existing invoice, we know that B3 is going to contain a value. So B3 is going to let us know if an E5 equals empty, please make sure to add a customer. Certainly we need to know, we need to make sure that we actually have a customer. Without a customer in E5, we cannot save the invoice. I want to determine the last item row, and I also want to make sure that they've entered items. If I try to add a new invoice, even if I've added a customer, if I haven't added any items and I try to save it, I want to let the user know to please make sure to add at least one item before saving. So all we need to do is check the last row of the value. If it's less than 9, we know they have not added any numbers. So that's going to happen right directly inside our code. We know that E9, if the last item row is less than 9, then we're going to check that last item row here using range and XLUP row. This will determine the last item row of column D. If it's less than 9, we know that there are no items. Okay, so then we can just exit out of the sub after we give them a message box. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn application calculation to manual, and I'm going to turn screen updating to false. This will make things a little bit faster, especially when we're dealing hundreds or maybe even thousands of items. We want things to happen fast, so we're going to turn those off. If you haven't seen me use it before, sometimes I do that when we work with a lot of data. Great, so what I want to do now is what I was mentioning to you before, is I need to determine whether it is an existing invoice or a new invoice. B3 is going to tell us that. We know that if B3 is empty, it is a brand new invoice. So there's a few things that we need to do when it's a new invoice. I want to make sure that the next invoice number, that's going to get placed directly inside here. And I also want to make sure that it's going to find the first available row and place that next invoice right here. So we can do that through here. Invoice row is equal to invoice list. It's going to get the first available row. We're going to take our next invoice number and place it directly in H1. It's coming from B5. I also want to take that exact same next invoice number and place it directly in column A, okay? But what if it's an existing invoice? If it's an existing invoice, I want to place it, we just want to extract the row from invoice. Okay, everything else is relatively simple. We'll move a little bit quicker on this so we can get to the print macros. I want to make sure that the date, the customer, the status, the terms, the due date, and the invoice total, all 6 of these variables, simply make it into the appropriate place here. The date, the customer, the status, the term, and the total. Notice the total didn't calculate. We're going to fix that right now. We know that our total is coming directly from here inside K5, so I want to make sure that that happens, right? So K5, not this, right? We're going to put that invoice total K5. Okay, good. Now we've got the right one. Now when we go ahead and save it, let's just go ahead and update that. So we're going to save this one. Now we're going to enter number 2. We're going to save this one. And now we're going to enter invoice number 3, and then we're going to save and update it. We go into the invoice list, and we see that our totals are now inside here properly. Okay, now that we have the right cell. Okay, very, very good. So we make sure that those are appropriate. Now all we need to do is update the items, right? We've updated all the main information. Now I need to make sure that those items get saved. I need to run a check, though. I need to know if the item was previously saved inside this database or not. How will we know that? Well, we're going to look at column B. We're going to determine the last row, which we've already done. And I'm going to loop from 9 all the way to the last row. And I'm going to check if B contains a value, we know it's been previously saved. If it is not, if it is a new one and it's empty, we know it has not been previously saved. We need to assign a brand new database for that. So we're going to do that here. Here's our loop for the item row equals 9 to the last item row. First thing we're going to do is going to check B in the item row. If it does not equal empty, then the database rows exist. We're simply going to take that database row and put it into a variable called invoice item row. However, if B in the item row is blank, we know it's a new database item row. We're going to take that invoice item row. We're going to extract that from the first available row on the invoice item. So our last row of the value plus 1 is going to be our first available row. Then what we're going to be doing is we're going to grab that invoice ID. I need to put that in column A. Why is that important? Because our invoice items must have an invoice ID, and that's got to go in column A. So we're going to put that directly inside column A. That's only going to be for new items. Also, I want to know the row that's associated with that. I want to know inside row, what is the invoice row, right? That's got to go. Remember, it starts at 9. So 9, 10, or 11, right? I want to put that row, and I also want to put the database row. What is the row of this database? That's going to help us when I bring the values in. So that's going to simply put a formula. We're using a formula. We're not using the exact row. And that way, if I delete an item, that everything's going to update accordingly. So we also want to take that formula and put that in here. And that's going to be here, add row formula. I also want to take that database row and I want to place it directly inside B. Because this is a new item, B is empty, right? I need to place that database row inside B. Then all I need to do is just bring over all the information. So then inside the invoice, I need to take whatever's information's all the way here, including the item, the description, the quantity, and the amount. And I simply need to bring it inside here. Item, description, quantity, and amount. And then, of course, the taxable status as well. That's going to be for all the items. Regardless if it is a new or an existing item, we're going to do the following. Going to take B, simply going B through E of our invoice items is going to equal D through G. This is simply our information. B through D, B through E is our item name, description, amount. It's going to come directly from our invoice here, D through G, D through G. So that's where we got it from. So now that we understand that we've gotten that through there, then all we need to do is update that taxable. That's going to come directly from column I, our taxable, and it's going to go into column F. So it's coming from column I here, and it's going directly inside our column F right here. It doesn't necessarily need to be formatted in Wingdings font. That doesn't matter. That's it. That's all we need to do to save and update the information. We're going to turn back on application screen updating to true, and we're going to turn the calculations to automatic. We're running a fade out message. Now, fade out message is simply that shape that you saw on our invoice. When I save and update, we see that there's a shape. That shape has a specific name, and that name is called invoice saved message, right? What I want to do is just basically make this fade out. You've seen this before. All we're doing is running a loop, and we're changing the fade, right, as we run the loop, and until we decide to make it invisible. That's it. That's all we need to do. Let the user know to make it. Okay, great. Adding the new customer. There's a brand new button called adding a new customer. If I want to add a new customer, I can do just that. All we're going to be doing is simply adding in the name and then clicking save. And that's it. Now, when we click save, what happens, right? That's going to be on here on the add new customer. If we view the code here, we click save button, right? Then we're going to basically saving that customer associated there. So all we need to know is the customer row. First of all, we want to make sure that field 1, there has to be a customer name. It must be a customer name. If field 1 of that form, remember that form that we saw, field 1 here, this is field 1. If that value is empty, we want to let the user know to make sure to save a customer. We can't save a customer if there's no name. So we want to make sure that it's not empty. Okay, then what we want to do is with customers. Now I want to save that customer. I want to determine the customer row since this is new. I want to make the first available row. And then what I want to do is I want to determine if it is, I want to find the max customer ID, looking at all the customer IDs inside there and determining the first available customer ID, which is going to be using the max formula and the customer ID. If I've got a set of customer IDs here all the way up to 10, and I set the max, the maximum is 10. If I want to know the next one available, it's going to be 10 plus 1. Right? So we go into the formulas, name manager, and we see we have customer ID here. So all we're doing is taking this, making sure that they're all numerical, taking this named range, we're getting the max number, and we're adding 1. We can do it both in formulas and we can do it in VBA. This does it in VBA, application worksheet function max. We're getting the max of all the customer IDs, we're adding 1. This is going to set the next customer ID. We're going to place that directly in A. We're going to wrap that in on our resume next in case it's not found. If A value equals empty, right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to add A and the customer value equals 1. We're going to set the first customer ID, right? We know that this, because if it's already empty, that means there are no customers at all. If there are no customers at all, this would be an error. That's why we've wrapped it in on error resume next. And then all we're doing is simply setting the default to 1, our first customer. Now all we need to do is just map the customer fields. We're going to take all those customer fields. Simply, I've been went over this before in another training, but basically these fields are named field 2, field 3, field 4, and all the way to field 7. So all we're going to be doing there is simply running from 2 to 8, and we're setting the values of each of those fields to individual customer columns. So basically, we're just simply adding the information. We're going to hide the form, and then what we're going to do is we're going to set that customer name. I need to update that to the correct cell. G5 is not correct, but it would be E4. E4 is going to take on that brand new customer name. So that's going to be E4, okay? E4 is going to take on that. That's all we need to do to add a new customer. So now that we've covered how to add a new customer, when we click that new, all we're going to be doing is adding that customer, clearing any contents, and then adding a new customer forms. This one, add new customer, clears the contents of the form and makes it visible. Just 2 lines of code to do that. One, to clear the form using unload, add customer form is going to clear all the contents of that form. The next line of code, add customer form dot show, is going to show that form. Okay, so that's all we need to do for that. All right, so invoice new. Invoice new is relatively simple. When we click invoice new, I want to clear a bunch of cells, right? We're going to have we're going to create a sample invoice here, right? And here is our footer here. This is going to be the cells, the columns that we're going to be using for printing. We're going to go over these in just a moment. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that we're also clearing anything here, and I'll show you how that works. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but we want to make sure that we're clearing all the customer. We're setting the defaults, right? What is the current date? I want to set the default status, the default terms. We already saw that, and I want to clear any contents out. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing on invoice new. First thing is I want to remove the header shapes. Again, this is the same code that we're going to go over in just a moment, but I want to show you how we create those before I show you how we remove them and why that's important. And it is important for sure. Okay, so first of all, I want to set the invoice load to true. That's going to make sure that we don't have anything else happen. I want to clear all the associated cells with that invoices, all the basically everything that's associated with that here. Then what I want to do is I want to set that next invoice number. I know what's going to be that next invoice number. If I do add new invoice here, I want to make sure that that next invoice number is invoice 4. That invoice 4 is automatically calculated using the max formula plus 1. So we know that our invoices, I've got 3 invoices. We know the next one's going to be 4. I want to place that directly inside H1. So we do that here with this line of code. Also, I want to set the current date in our invoice date defaulted to the current date. H3 is our invoice date, and we're going to set it to the current date, which is just simply date. And then I want to set the invoice load to false. Now what I want to do is I want to determine what term should I have. Remember, I said we had some default terms, new invoice, right? That default term is going to be net 90, right? But if I decide I'm going to change it to net 15, right? When I do a new invoice, I want that term to be net 15, right? So how are we going to do that? Well, we know we just need to look for this little check mark. If I know what row it's found on, I'm going to simply look here, find out what row that check mark is. If I've found, then I know what row is set to default. So let's find that check mark. We know that that check mark previously is called character 252. So that's exactly what I'm going to look for. I'm going to extract the row from that. And what I'm going to look for, I'm going to look for it directly in the admin columns H6 through H23. That's where I'm looking for it, H6 through H23. If it's found, I want to extract the row from it. If it's not found, it could create an error. So we're going to wrap it in on error resume next. Now, if the term row is found, it's not going to be 0. So if the term row does not equal 0, then I'm simply going to put in the default term inside H5. Now, H5 inside is our terms right here. So what's H5? H5 is going to be equal to whatever is located inside column F and the found row. So it's going to be equal to the admin F, and that term row is going to set the default term. We're going to use almost exactly the same thing for the status row, right? Status has very much the same thing. If we say I want to know what status, I'm again going to look inside D6 through D12. I'm going to look for that character 252. I want to extract what row it's found on. And if it's been found, I want to return whatever's in C in that row. So we can do just that here. It works great to find anything. Don't forget to wrap it in on error resume next and on error go to 0. So that status row is simply going to be D6 through D12. That's where we're looking. We're finding that character 252. And we're extracting the row from it. If it is found, right, we know that that status row is not going to be 0. Then simply taking H4 and placing directly inside whatever's in C in the status row, right? And what that means is basically inside here, located that status, H4 is simply going to be equal to whatever that wherever it's found, the row that's been found, whatever's in C and the row that's been found. And that's how we place our default status. Relatively straightforward code on that, and that's going to help us out. Great, so that's all we need to do on invoice new. Now, when we load it, what do I want to do? When I load it, we've already been over. We know that when we make a change to K1, and we know that the search row here is correct, there is a value there. Take that one, load it in here, put that invoice number here, and then run the macro to load it. So that's what we're going to do now. Remember, that was on our worksheet change. So if we take a look back inside our invoice, when we made a change to K1 here, right, the last thing we were going to do is running the macro called invoice load. It is that macro that we're going to go over right now here. Okay, so the first thing, again, I'm going to remove all the header shapes. We'll be going over that in a minute. I want to show you how we create them, but we're creating shapes for individual headers, and I want to remove them all the time because they're going to create a delay if they're existing, and I'll show you why in a moment. Okay, first of all, I want to make sure that when we load an invoice, we must have an invoice row that's associated. Without a row, we cannot move ahead. So we want to make sure that B3 contains a value. If it doesn't, then we know it's an incorrect invoice, and we're going to let the user know with please enter a correct invoice. Let's spell that correctly for a change. Please enter correct spelling. Okay, please enter a correct invoice number. We're going to exit the sub out. I'm going to set that invoice row as a variable. Right. I want to make sure we set the invoice load to true. I'm going to clear out any contents of the existing invoice here. Then again, all I'm going to do is just do the reverse. We're not using data mapping in this case. There's just 5 different rows here. So we're going to place inside H3, we're going to place that invoice date. E4 is going to take on the customer, invoice status, the terms, and the due date are simply going to come directly over from this invoice list here on the selected row. I'm going to bring it over into this header information here. Once we have that, we're going to turn off application screen updating. We're going to turn off calculation. I'm going to set them to manual. This will make things a lot faster, and we have a lot of items. And we're going to focus directly on the invoice items sheet now. I need to know the last row of that, right? We need to know the last row of those invoice items. That's going to be based on that database. Lend up. If the last row is less than 4, we're going to go to no items. So what I want to do is I want to determine all of the invoice items for this specific invoice. So how do we do that? Well, we've got a list of invoices. What I want to do is I want to run an advanced filter, and I want to know only those items associated with invoice ID 1. So we can run an advanced filter based on criteria, and I can set the criteria here, and it's going to be based on the invoice H1. That is our invoice number, right? So if I know, it's going to return only those items associated with invoice 1 to do that. So if I load up an invoice with a few less, we can see that we have only 4 items associated with this. So if we go back to the invoice items, we see that invoice ID only has those 3 items here. Scrolling all the way up, let's go ahead and scroll all the way up. We see that we only have these 4 items associated with that, and of course their taxable status. So I want to run an advanced filter. I only want to know that. So to determine that, we need the last row. So we're going to get that last row. If it's less than 4, we have no items. We're going to run that advanced filter based on A3 through I in the last row. 3 is our header row. All the way through I, we're using a blank, right? I'm using a blank. Notice our data only comes to H, but I'm using it to I. And why is that? Because our results also have a blank. Why do our results have a blank, right? Well, so does our original invoice. Let's take a look at this. The item database row, then a blank, then the item, description, quantity, and amount. So it helps in the code. It's much easier if I can bring all that over into one line, right? And all I need to do is match the results that come in. So all I need to do is match the results to make sure there's also a blank, bring it all the way up until the amount, then a formula, then the tax. And that's just what we're going to do inside the code. So once we have those results, the criteria is going to go J2 through J3 as we saw here. And we also want the results to come L2 through S, right? So L2 through S is where those results are going to go. That's where we want them. We're going to determine the last row of our results based on column L. If that last result is less than 3, then we don't have any items. All we need to do then is loop through all the items. Looping through all the items, I know what row they're associated. I need to know what row to place them on the invoice, 9, 10, 11, or 12. And then we're just simply going to place them here. So the first thing we're going to do is extract that row. So that invoice item row is going to be based on column S, right? That's where that invoice row is located, column S. So we're going to bring that over. And then all we're going to be doing is we're going to bring it all the way from B through G is simply equal to L through Q. What does that mean? That means that B through G is equal to L through Q. Okay, so that covers everything except for the tax amount. The tax amount is going to be located right here. Before we add in that tax, remember our invoice doesn't contain, we clear the formula out. So each time we need to put that formula back in, I can put it in through VBA right here inside column H. Formula is simply equal to equals F and the invoice item row times G in the invoice item row. So that's going to take care of that. And then all we need to do is just add in that tax. That tax is going to come directly in I and coming from R. Okay, so we're just going to loop through all the results and do that, right? Last thing, we're going to set the invoice load to false, screen updating to true, and calculations to automatic. Okay, deleting, relatively simple. When we delete an invoice, we just need to make sure that we're deleting the associated items as well. So if I do that, for example, what I want to make sure is if I decide I'm going to delete this invoice, I will create a new invoice and then we'll go ahead and delete it. So new invoice, right? I'll add a few items onto here. I want to make sure that we are going to also, if we didn't save it yet, it's very easy. Delete the invoice. Do we want to delete the invoice? And let's click yes. All we need to do is clear the contents out because it hasn't been saved. But however, what if we do decide to save it, right? If I do decide to save it first, then I want to make sure that we're deleting all the associated database rows with it. So when we save it, let's go ahead and add a custom. I keep forgetting to do that. When we save it, I want to make sure that these rows also 114, 115, and 116 get deleted as well. So to ensure that, what we need to do is we need to go through the code and make sure. So the first thing what we want to do is let the user know, are you sure you want to delete this invoices? Delete invoice, yes, okay, or no, okay. In this case, if it's no, we're just going to exit the sub out if the user says no. But what I need to know is if the invoice has been saved yet. We know B3 is going to take on, if B3 contains a value, we know there's a database row that's associated with that invoice, so we know it's been saved. If it's not, all we need to do is pretty much do new invoice and clear it out. But if it has been saved, we can move on. So if B3 equals empty, then it's not saved. We'll skip all the way down here and just run the macro invoice new. However, it has been saved, we need to do other things. First thing what we want to do is extract that row. Invoice row is going to be into a variable called B3 called invoice row coming from B3. Then what we want to do is I want to delete that row on the main invoice. I want to make sure that that row gets deleted here. So we extract that row directly from B3, in this case 6, right? And I want to make sure to delete that row here. So we can use this one, invoice list, range, invoice row, and quotation, colon, quotation, invoice row, entire row dot delete. That's going to delete that entire row. Next up, I also want to remove all the associated items with that. So I need to look in item database 114, 115, and 116 inside the invoice items and make sure that those items get deleted anyways. However, there's a bit of a trick to it, right? If I decide I'm going to delete 114 first, then it's going to change the location for 15 and 16. So we need to make sure that we delete the highest row first, 116, then 115, and then 114 in that order, making sure that we're doing the highest row first. And that's why we bring in these orders here. So to do that, we're going to make sure the last row, determine the last row of the invoice items, right? If the last row is less than 3, we're going to go to not saved. I want to run an advanced filter, right? I need to know all the items associated with this, right? So if we're going to bring that on, I need to make sure that invoice number 4 contains 4 items. So we need to run an advanced filter on that just as we did before. So we're going to run an advanced filter. We're going to make sure those results come in L2 through R2. And we want to make sure, let's make sure that that's 3. That should be 3. I haven't tested this out. And it's going to be inside J. I better update the code because I did not test this macro out, but I'll test it live with you guys. That way you can see my mistakes. So J2 through J3 is where we're going to go. And then that's where the criteria L2. Now I want to make sure the last results row is based on L. If that last result's less than 3, that means it's go to not save, right? There's nothing here. We can go to not save. That means there's nothing, there's no items here. We can skip that. If there's a single row, I don't need to sort it, but I really do need to sort it. I want to sort this. Notice it's 110 through 113. I want 113 up at the top and I want 110 at the bottom. I want them sorted basically descending manner based on the row number. So I can delete 113 first, then 112, then 111, and then 110 in that order. I want to make sure that it's always reverse order that I'm deleting them. So we need to sort them, and we need to sort them based on the value in L3, and I need to make sure that they're sorted descent. Then I want the results to come from, I want that set range L3 through S. That should be S here. Gonna update that. So I want to make sure, and this should be S2 here. Okay, good. So we got the updates there. So then what I want to do is I want to loop through the results. I want to extract the item row from column L, and I want to delete that invoice row, and that's all we need to do in there. Okay, so let's saving our changes, right, that we made, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to delete this invoice. So I'm going to make sure that macro has been assigned to the right button, because I'm not even sure if I got that far. Assigning that macro, invoice delete here, it's the one we want, clicking OK, and we're going to, of course, save our work here. Invoice, always save your work before you delete. Are you sure you want to run this? Just click no. Okay, try it again. Click yes. Okay, and then let's just debug that. See invoice row. Okay, making sure. So again, H is not correct. So I want to make sure our invoice items, right, should go to H. Our results, particularly, our results contain a blank. So we want to make sure that our criteria, that our original data also contains a blank. So when we make this I, which contains a blank, and then we continue on, we see that it now works just fine. Okay, so the only issue we had was that our results had a blank, but our original data didn't. As soon as we made this column I, it was able to run. And then it ran them, and then it got deleted. So we'll take a look inside that. We'll notice, let's go down to the bottom, making sure that the last one, notice the last one is 3. There's no more 4 here, no more. And our invoice list, we see that 4 is also gone here. And our invoice has been cleared out. Perfect. So that is working great. That's just the way I want to see it. Okay, that's it. That's all we have as far as the invoice. Now let's get into the really cool part about printing. I wanted to make sure that, especially for those new people or people that have seen this maybe just once, I want you to understand the fundamentals on how to create these really cool invoices, because they are super powerful. But now I want to get into how to print it. But before I get to that, just a quick reminder for those of you who have yet to join our Patreon platform, what you have been missing, because I've been creating some really incredible additions to these applications, and I just wanted to share them with you. For our mobile employee timesheet we created just a few weeks ago, I created this incredible dashboard right inside, only exclusively for our Patreon members. For our accounts payable, I showed you how you can use both external icons and local icons. Came from a great suggestion, so we can do that. Inside our bank sync manager, right, we're able to update transactions completely, even after those transactions came and were replaced from Google Sheets. So I showed you a great way to do that. And of course, for our software license manager just last week, we now have the ability to automatically create email templates based on those licenses, so quickly creating these emails. And for our software license manager, we also have the ability to create email templates and multiple templates, so we can actually create additional templates and automatically send out those templates even just with a single click. It's automatically going to create the email that we can do to send that. So dynamic email content. So there's a lot of things you're missing if you're not yet in the Patreon. I'll make sure to include the links down below. Make sure you join us on Patreon. Along with those updated trainings, we have additional PDF codebook downloads. We have early discounts. We have tons and tons of great features inside our Patreon platform. Make sure you get in there. There's lots of great things going on there. All right, thanks so much. Let's continue on. The challenge before us today is, how do we create a professional invoice along with that has many lines? So in this case, particular invoice, we've got over 100, we got 112 different rows. Obviously that's not going to fit on a single page. So what I want to do is, when I print that, I want to make sure that that gets printed automatically in a professional manner. And that means I want a header on every single page, and I want a page number. I also want to make sure that we have a floating footer, so that our footer comes along, includes our subtotal, includes our tax and everything else in a footer. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. Now, the best way to do that is to keep our original invoice intact, not touch anything with that. And all we want to do is create something that can be printed. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to create another invoice, but this one's going to be formatted for printing. As we notice, we've got a header here, and then as we come down, we've got another header here. We go down here on our page 3, we've got another header here, and lastly, we've got a footer here. So you see, if we set that print, we can then, when we preview it, if we were to preview it, we see we've got a nice little printable invoice with duplicate headers on multiple pages, and our last page contains a footer. All right, so how are we going to do that? Well, the best way to do that is to duplicate the header. Notice we've got a header. This is actually a picture tool. All we've done is actually taken a picture of this header using VBA and then created a picture tool, so created a duplicate. How would we do that? Well, just with our picture tool here, of course, we're going to use VBA to do that and to take that picture here. So we just select any range at all, and then we have that picture tool. So it's based on this formula here, based on this formula, D1 through I7. In fact, I want to make it through I8. I want to include that header. So you'll include that header, and it's going to include it. So we then have a picture. We can then use this and duplicate that. And it is that we're going to use here. And I also want to use that for every page. So all we need to do is determine the number of rows that we have on a single page. It's about, let's say, 39 for this type of print. Then we add another header. Then we do another, however many rows there are. We do another header. All we need to do is duplicate the header we have here, add in the remaining rows, however many they are, then add a footer in. And we also have a footer. Now a footer is dynamic. Now let's take a look at this. Notice that this footer has our footer message in it. If we were to change our footer message, let's go all the way up here to the top, changing our footer message from summer sale to thank you, we see that down our footer has now changed. So we go all the way down here and we see that our footer, and let's bring it up here. Right here, that our footer has changed. Thank you for your continued support. So what we do is we have some dynamic shapes here. Let's go ahead and bring that up here all the way to the top. I'll zoom out and I'm going to bring it up so that we can see how we create this footer. I'm just going to move it up here to where its location is linked to the cells that we're going to link it. So basically we have a group of shapes, right? And those group of shapes are linked to, let's do the footers what I want, not that header, not yet. So this header right here, there we go. So this footer right here, this is the one I want. Don't worry, everything gets replaced. We can move it. That's the great thing about this code. We can move things around. As soon as we print it again, it's all going to get reset just perfectly. Okay, so this is what I want to show you here. I'm going to zoom in on that. I've got a footer here. This is a group of shapes. So basically I've got here 7 different shapes here, 7 different texts. These are just rectangles and they're linked to data. So if we were going to insert here, illustrations, and then shapes, and then we're going to just create a text box. So this text box is simply going to be linked to wherever I want. Now, if we remember, if we take a look at it, that particular, let's say the thank you message was linked to a specific cell, right? It was, wasn't it? We'll look over here all the way into BA9. That's where it's linked, right? So if I take this box here and I do equals and then A9, we're going to see that whatever is placed in A9 is going to be displayed here. And that means as I change this thank you message here, it's going to also change here. So we see that it's automatically changed. Great. So now what if we linked other shapes with whatever's located in our subtotal? So let's say I want to link subtotal here, or I want to link that subtotal here to whatever is located inside K3. And that's just what we did right here. K3 is located in our subtotal. This here is linked, this shape here is linked to our K4. It's located in our tax. And this shape here is linked to our total, which is in K5, right? So then all I've done is I've taken all these shapes here, these 6 subtotal shapes along with the footer message, and I've grouped them together. And I've grouped them in something called the footer group. And then we're going to place that down. So all I need, notice that everything got messed up. All I need to do is just do print the invoice one more. It's going to print it automatically. It's going to reset everything in the right exact spot just as we want. It's going to print it out to the default printer, which is Snagit. Everything gets placed. And if we zoom out, we see what it looks like on the zoom out. We see that we've got our, let's a little bit too much there. We see that we've got the headers here, our place, our picture here, our place, our items, and our picture. So everything is organized accordingly. Great. And VBA is going to do all the heavy lifting for us. So it's going to place that footer. So the first thing what we want to do is we created a footer here. This footer is just a collection of shapes and then the group called footer group. VBA will place that for us right where it needs to be placed, which is right here. And it's also going to set this. So let's see the macro that does that. We've got several macros, but we only need one macro that's going to actually place it. All those macros are called print macros, right? So we have print to PDF, But each one of them, what we want to do is we want to set the print area, right? I want to set that print. I want to create one single macro that sets the print area. I want to bring over all the appropriate items, however many on a single page, bring them to here, and then determine how many pages there are. And then what we want to do is we want to place them, separate them, and then create that print area. So for each page, we want to create a new header. Now we can create that header, but keep in mind that these are picture tools, right? This is a picture tool. These use a lot of memory. So the best way to do it, a lot of memory, right? Your application, when you use this, it is going to slow down tremendously. Now the good thing is, since VBA creates this for us, I can delete them whenever I want. Watch what happens. Let's take a look at this. Okay, if we don't, this is the first part of macro. We're going to remove all of those headers. That's the first thing we want to do. This is given a name. We see that the name is called header template, right? So what we want to do is the first part of this macro is remove everything that contains header, right? If we don't, things are going to slow down. Watch what happens, right? If I don't remove these, this is an important lesson, right? So let's take a look at, remember we went over invoice save or invoice update. Invoice save and update, okay? Remember, we're going to remove every single one of the, I told you we'd go over this later. Now we're coming right back to it. I need to remove every single one of these header. This is called header template. This is called header 2. This is called header 3, and so on and so forth. But each one of them contain the word header. I want to remove these before pretty much doing anything in Excel, anything, regardless of the macro, because everything slows down when these are here. I only really need these. Theoretically, we could delete these right after print, but I want to be able to show them to you. But we only need them when we're printing to PDF or we're printing to a local printer. That's the only time needed. The picture tool is a great tool, but it is super heavy on memory. Okay, so if I comment this out, you're going to see just how slow our application runs. Even though I've got application screen updating manual, true. So believe me, it's slow. Okay, so let's do a new invoice, and I've commented those out. And I think you'll, even with a few items, you'll get to see how slow it is if I don't delete those headers first, right? So take a look at this. Here is the save and update. We went over this macro. I'm not deleting the headers that were already created. I'm going to save and update. Let's add a customer. I keep forgetting. It's just a mental block. Let's just accept that I'm never going to remember that. Save and update it. Okay, that was pretty fast, but let's take a look at, let's remove this here. I'm going to turn this off. That was kind of fast, but it is slow. It's actually very slow, believe me, when you have a lot of items. So we're going to add more items, but with application screen updating, we shouldn't need application screen updating to manual and application calculation to. So now let's save and update that. It's still fast, but believe me, it's slow. Okay, so when we load it, same thing when we load it. If I were to load this invoice, let's take a look at invoice load. This one I want again, comment out these, right? So I want to show you it's going to load very, very slow. Okay, that was pretty fast too. It really means slow. It was slow. Okay, let's turn this off. I want to show you how slow it is. Believe me. Okay, let's try it. Let's see, did we remove those? That's why it's fast. They got removed already, didn't they? You see that? That's why it's fast, because those pictures got removed. Let's print it first. Right? When we print it, it's going to create those shapes, which is exactly what we want. Once it gets printed, those shapes are going to be created, right? But I'm not deleting them now. I'm going to save and update this. Okay, now you see, it's still saving. It's still saving. Nothing's happening. I can't click anything. It's still saving. It's ridiculously slow. It's still saving, right? As soon as you see the pop-up. So I don't think we need to continue this anymore because you see how slow it is. So I'm just going to debug, and it's just basically, let's see where we were on with invoice. Let's see what item row we're on. We're on, it's very, very slow. Okay, so you get the point with those pictures still present, right? Let's reset it. With those pictures still present here, everything gets much slowed down. So all we need to do is make sure to delete any of those camera tool pictures. Not any picture, but pictures that are linked to specific cells. I don't know why this uses a ton of Excel memory, but it does, which is okay because we don't need them. We only need them when we're printing, and we don't need them after that. So we want to make sure that we remove these pictures, just as I did here, removing any of those pictures, whether it's on save or update or whether we're loading, pretty much when we do anything, because we only need them in one instance. So that's an important lesson. Okay, and we can also I still like to turn on application screen updating, but it's not necessary not necessary to turn it off necessarily. It's still pretty fast. Okay, so we're good to go on that. So we understand the need, so now let's take a look at what did we just load it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click here, load it here. Now we're going to see how fast it is. It's pretty fast without those pictures. So those pictures got removed, which is what we want. Okay, so we understand why we're removing them, and we're going to how do we bring them in. I'm going to print it one last time to place those in there so that we can show you how we're going to build this through the macro that we're going to go. Okay, so inside that macro we're going to go, and that's the first one we're going to go over, which is the print save area. This we don't need here. We don't need this here. We did not use that here. It was some idea that I had. It was a good idea, but I didn't need it. Found a better way around it. We can also measure page breaks, but we don't need it because I know how many rows that we need. So I'm going to go over that with you right now. So first thing what we want to do is to mention the head shape as shape. As I mentioned to you, I want to remove every single shape that has the word header in it. That's very important because those use a lot of memories. We only need them. We're going to create them, but if there's any previous, I want to remove them. So we can loop through every single shape inside the sheet with header shape and shapes, and any shape that using the in-string command, any shape name that contains the word header, as long as it's greater than 0, then we're going to delete it. Okay, we're just going to loop through that, make sure that only shapes that you want removed contain the word header. Now what I want to do is I want to create, let's do that. Let's get to this point right here. I'm going to run this macro. It's going to remove them. Okay, so now I have no header shapes here. What I want to do is I want to create basically a picture tool of this, right? I just want to create a duplicate of that, and I want to link it so that it's automatically linked to whatever the values are in here. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that range D1 through I8, D1 through I8, and I'm going to copy the picture. Inside R1 here, I'm going to paste the special of that, right? So inside R1, I'm going to paste special. That's going to paste that picture directly in here. However, that picture is not going to be linked. So if we do F8, we see that it's going to be created, and we see it's been pasted here. But now I want to make sure that it is linked, right? I've only created a picture. How do we do that? We're going to focus on the selection. Notice that it's been selected already. What I want to do is I want to assign a formula to this shape here, and we can do it through this line of code, equals D1 through I8. So as we do that, see how it just assigned it that formula? Now it's been assigned. So now it's linked to that range automatically. And I want to give it a very specific name. I could give it any name I'll give it header template. This way we can quickly and easily duplicate it. So we're giving it a name called header template. Okay, so now it has that name header template. So as we move on, so now what we can do is we can clear any previous data. So I want to clear all the previous data. Anything that's in here, I want to clear. So all the way from RW to W99, I want to clear that out. Okay, so now everything is cleared out. Great, so continuing on with the code, we'll just run our code. And what I want to do now is I want to, let's go ahead and get out of here and back into the macro we are on. We can undo that. So once we've cleared it out, I want to determine the last row of the invoice, right? I need to know how many items we're working with. That's very important because I need to know how many pages. So the last row here is 112. I need to put that into a variable. That variable is called here last invoice row. That's the last row of the invoice. If the last row is less than 9, just let the user know to please add one item to the invoice before printing, right? We should at least have one row. I'm going to turn off application calculations, set that to manual, and also turn off screen updating, set that to false. That'll make things a little quicker. I don't necessarily need this one. I'm going to comment that out. Determine the page quantity. I want to know how many pages. Now I figured out all we need to do is just do a print preview, just print preview. Let's say we decide we're going to set this as our print. Let's say I want to know how many lines. I'm going to set this. I'm going to set this as our print area. Let's just take, for instance, we're going to set this. So we're going to go to the page layout and we're going to set the print area to this. Okay. And now I'm going to preview it. So I'm just going to click here to our print preview. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to see, okay, I see that I want to look at our last line, or a supply line 18, and then ceramic, and then RAM. So those are the last 3 lines of code. So I see the last 3 lines on a single page. I want to know how many items are going to fit on a single page. So I can see that where it is. So RAM, then sink, then ceramic, then supply line. Okay, so we're going to escape out of here. And we're going to look for that right down here. And we're going to see that it's going to be about right here. 39, right? So 41. So we see where our dotted lines are. We see the last line here, right? We see it here. We see those dotted lines, supply line, RAM 36. So we can, once we see that, we know, so let's count how many items we have here inside it. We have 39 items. So we know that along with the header, we can fit in 39 items all the way to our markets inside a single sheet. Okay, so if we know that we're going to add, we want a header on every page, and we know we've got at least 39. So all I need to do is determine a simple division to determine how many sheets we're going to need based on the number of items. So using that, our page quantity is simply going to be, we're going to use a round up for that. I want to determine the last invoice row minus 8, right? I want to deduct. Why are we subtracting 8? If I want to determine how many items. If I know 112 is the last item row, and I subtract 8, because 8 is going to be for our header, right? We don't want to include that. I want to determine how many items, right? So I know how many items. So I only want to extract the item, not the row. So our last invoice row minus 8, this is the number of items we have in our invoice. If I divide that by 39, that's going to determine the number of pages. It might be a decimal, so I want to make sure that we're going to round up, and we're not going to use any decimals. So that's going to get us the total number of pages that we need. So, but if the page quantity is 1, we don't need to create additional headers, right? So we're going to do something. If the page number is 1, we're going to do something else if it's more than 1. So if it's just 1, we only have 1 page, what we're going to do is simply copy all the items to the last row. Let's say we only had, say it was down here. We only would need to copy however many items that we have, and then bring that over into that. So I'm going to copy those items and bring them directly into our area. Now we use the same exact conditional formatting as we did on the original. So we're just using the same, except this one's based on column R. So as we bring in those items here, and what else do we need to do? Well, what I want to do is bring in the items, and then what I want to set a page and row to the last invoice row plus 1. Basically, I need to know where to place that footer. So that footer is going to be based on a variable called page and row, and that's important. And it's going to be based on the last invoice row plus 1, because that's exactly where we're going to paste them, right? So if our footer here, okay, let's go down to the last row. So if our footer here is located on the last row, I need to place it where? So if our last row is here, is 128, I need to know to place our footer on 129. So this is going to be turned. So we're going to use that variable. That variable is very important. So our last page. Then we're going to skip everything else, right? Because it's only one quantity, so we don't need to skip. We'll skip everything else, and we're going to go directly down to set the print area. But if it's not one page, if it's more than one page, we need to do something else. I'm going to set the number of items per page to 39. I want to put that in a variable. I want to set the initial page end row to 47. Why is that? So let's say our initial page end row is right here, 47. Why is that? Because it's 39 plus we need 8 for the header. We have to have 8 for the header, and we need the top row. So our first is 8 and our last. So our first page end row is going to be 47, right? So 47. Page end row 47. I also want to know the next invoice row. What is the next page for the invoice row? That's going to be 48. We're setting the next one up, right? I want to know, right? Where's the first? Notice our next page starts here, right? It's going to be 48. I want to set that. I need to know where to place that header, and I want to place it directly on row 40. Great. So now what I want to do is I want to set the first page print. So we're going to set that up. How do we do that? Well, we're going to set it up here. Just bring in all the values over from the R9 through W in the page end row. Remember, our page end row is 47, right? So all I'm going to do is bring this information. This simply is going to be equal to whatever's here. So all the way up. So same thing. So just bring in value to value exchange, row to row exchange. Just bring it. It's very, very simple at this point, right? So we're just bringing R9 through W equals D9 through I. Just bringing all the values from our original invoice only up to the page and rows. Now what I want to do is I don't know how many pages there are, so we need to create a loop, and we're going to loop through all the pages. If there's 20 pages, we're going to loop through all those pages. So we're going to do that. So the page start row, right? I want to know what start row. Remember, our page end row is 47 in this case. We're going to set our page start row to 48. So page start row. So now what we're going to do is for the page number equals 2. Remember, we've already done page 1 up here, already added page 1 either here or here, but now we're going through page 2. So page number is going to keep track of what page we're on. It's going to be 2 to the page quantity, right? So we're going to create those subsequent payments. Now, first thing what I want to do is I want to create a header, right? So we've already done our initial header. I'm going to duplicate that and give it a specific name. So to do that, we can do that right here. Shapes, header template, duplicate, equals header and then the page number. We'll just set the page number and making sure that it contains the full word header, and that way we can remove it. So now we're going to focus on placing that header. I'm going to place it, that particular shape, header and the page number, I'm going to place it the left position. It's going to be based on R and the page start row plus just a little bit over to the right. And I also want to paste it on the top position, R and the page top start row. So basically that's going to place it directly right here based on this start row, which is 48 and R. So it's going to place it right there. Great. I also want to make sure that the width, I want to make 100% sure that the width of this header is going to be the same as the width of all columns R through W. So we can ensure that the width is correct just to make sure. So the width is going to be invoice range R through W, set the width. Now remember, we need to call out these sheets again because we're inside this width shape. So I need to call out that sheet again. Great. So now what I want to do is I want to update that page start row, right? We've now added the header, but that start row is going to move down, right? It's no longer going to be 48. I want to make it now 56. That's where we're going to add the rest of our items. So I need to add 8 onto that. So we're doing that right here. Our page start row is equal to whatever it was plus 8, because this is the row that we're going to start placing our items on. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to check to make sure to see if I want to set the number of rows to copy over. How many rows are we copying over? If I know, is it a full sheet? Are we copying over all 39, right? Do we have a full sheet? Or are we copying over whatever's left? So I need to determine that, right? So we can do an if statement based on the number of left, right? Because we know if it's the last page, if we're on the last page, we don't have that many items to copy over, right? We don't have all 39. Maybe we only have, in this case, 26, right? So how many items are we going to be copying over? So we're going to take a look inside this, and I'm going to do if the next row plus the page item quantity, the next invoice row, plus the page item quantity is greater than the last invoice row, that means what I want to do is I want to keep track of all those invoices. I want to know the next invoice row plus all the ones that are remaining, right? Is it greater than the last row or not? So are we on the last page or not? And that's really all we need to determine if it's the last page. If it is, then the invoice quantity, how many items are being brought over? How many items? It's simply going to be the last item inventory row minus the next invoicing row plus 1. I know this is quite confusing. And basically what I want to do is I want to determine if we have less than 39 items left. Let's take a look inside to here. Okay, you see the line here? So what I want to do is I want to basically count how many items do we have a row. If this, let's say 30, right, plus 82, if it's less than the last item row, 112, then I know we're already on the last page. I want to set the number of items to only what's left, would be 30. Or maybe it's more. If it's more than, if we still have more pages, then we're going to set it to the maximum, which is 39, right? So then we're simply setting the last item, the number of items that we need to bring over to the last inventory row minus the next plus 1. So this means this is the last sheet, right? We're only bringing a limited over. Otherwise, we have more sheets to go, more sheets at next. So then we're just going to set it to the limit. Our page item quantity is 39. We're setting our invoice item, the number of items to bring over, to our maximum because there's more pages than the existing one. So we're simply determining whether, if it's the last page, we're just limiting them. So now what I want to do is I want to check for the maximum rows on the last page. Keep this in mind. If it is on the last page and we have maximum rows, we need to like let's say we do have 39 rows, there's not going to be enough room for the footer. What does that mean? Let's say I have exactly, bring it up here. Let's bring that footer up here. And let's say I have exactly 39 rows left, right? If I have 39 rows left exactly, this footer is going to be off the sheet, right? It's going to be off. It's going to be on the next sheet. I need to make sure that our page break is correct so it shows the footer off the page. So we need to compensate for that. So what we're going to be doing is we're simply going to check here. If the page number is the last, if we're on the last page number, right? We're already on the last page number, the current page number. Remember, we're looping through the page numbers. For the page number equals page quantity. This is our last page number here. This is, we're looping through. So if we're on the last one, meaning page number equals page quantity, and invoice item quantity equals greater than 36, right? That means we're going to overflow. That means I cannot put the footer on the current sheet, right? I can't put the footer because there's not enough space for the footer, right? There's not enough rows for the footer. I have to put the footer on the next page, right? So all I need to do is increase the page quantity one more time. It means our last page, we have so many items that we don't have enough space for the footer. We need to increase the page quantity one more time, and we're going to simply place that footer on the next page. So that's all we need to do, is just increase the page quantity by 1. And that's only in the case when we have a lot of items on our last page. So that just checks to make sure that we have that. Next up, what we're going to do is we're simply going to place all of the items, however many items there are, into our, let's call this our staging area, our printing area. So we're going to do that. All we need to do is R through W, R in the page start row, through the page start row plus the number of items that we're bringing over minus 1. And we're simply going to bring them directly over from the next invoice row to the next invoice row. Remember, the next invoice row, this variable keeps track of where we are on here. Okay, this variable here, page start row, page end row, those keep track of the rows that we're on here. I need to keep track of 2 different rows. I need to know where we are here as we move down, and I also need to know where we are. Let's move that up so it makes a little bit more clarity. And I also need to know where, however many numbers we keep as we grow through the invoice. I need to keep track of what row we're on here as we move down, right? They're separate rows because these include headers, these don't. So I need to keep track of both. Our next invoice row always keeps track of the row that we're on here, so we know as we move down. Our page start rows and our page end rows keep track of the rows that we're on here in our staging area. So we need to update both, right? I need to update both the invoice row here and I need to update the page row here. So we can do that with the next line of code. So the next invoice row is based on the next invoice row, whatever current, plus the invoice item quantity. So as we create one, as we bring all the items over to the next sheet, I need to update that next invoice row, right, which is down here. I also need to update the page row on the right side here. We need to keep track of the pages here. So in this case, our page start row is simply the page start row. Let's put in some notes here. Update original invoice item count. And then we're going to say we're going to update our, let's call this our staging page count. Okay, so the variables, the comments help a little bit understand. Okay, so we just need to keep going through and keeping track of both as we loop through next page. So that's all we need to do to loop through all the pages. Now, if the item quantity is greater than 36, I want to update the page end row, right? I want to update that. Here we go. If we're going to check once again, if the invoice is greater than 36, then I need to make sure that our page end row is the page start row plus the page item quantity minus the invoice quantity. I know this is kind of confusing, right? But basically what we need is to show footer on next page when we have a full page of items on the last page, right? We're already done. We've already looped through all the pages, right? I just want to make sure that if we have a lot of items on our last page, we just need to simply update that page start row to the page item. I want to update that footer and put it on the next page. Else, we're simply going to update the page end row up. In other words, here's what I mean. If it's the last, right, I need to update this and put this down here. Otherwise, this footer is just going to be on the last row, okay? So, all right. So now we've updated that. So once we've gotten through, now we're going to simply set that footer area, right? We know where to place that footer is going to be on the page end row. That's where we're placing our footer. So we have our footer group. We've created our group of shapes. We're simply going to set the left position based on the invoice R in the page end row left and the top position. And just like we did the header, I want to ensure that that footer is the width of that footer is always the width of between R and W. So we're going to do that here. So setting that width. Now what we're going to do is we're going to update that page end row. We're going to adjust the last row for the footer, right? The page end row equals the page end row plus 2. So I want to make sure that, what do I mean by that? That means that I need to include this footer in our print, right? So here, if our page, let's say our page end row was 129, right? I need to make sure that this footer is included in the print. So if I add 2 and make it to 131, when I set that print preview, when I set that print page setup, I want to make sure that all the rows, including up to 131, get set inside the print area, right? I want to make sure that the footer is included in the print area. So I need to add 2, 1, 2 to make sure it is. So when it's placed here, I'm going to make sure that it's included all the way to 131 gets printed. So that's why we need to increase the page end row by 2, because then the next step is to actually create that page setup. That page setup is going to start all the way at the top on R1. It's going to go all the way to W and the last page row, which is 131 in this case. So we do that here. So we're going to set that print area using the page setup, R1 through W and the page end row. This sets our print area. I also want to align the top margin, right? The top margins are slightly different between PDF and print, so I wanted to make those adjustments. For a print, it was 40. On your printer, you may want to adjust these just to make sure that everything fits just right. I want to set application screen updating to true and automatic. Okay, so all that this macro does is set the print area. It doesn't print it, doesn't do anything, it just sets the print area. So when we run this macro, you can see that is exactly what we're doing, just setting that print area. So now everything's organized here, and we have our footer and we have our last row. And if you see here, we have our print area set up automatically. Great. So the next 2 macros are going to do just that. We've got one that says print preview. I think I was going to add that into the macro. I was going to create a button that says print preview. I thought it was kind of nice, but it's okay. Just preview. It's kind of a nice having a button that previews it. So now we can show the next page. We see that we have a great print preview. Not that important, but just something helpful. And then we're going to print. Printing, all we're going to be doing again is running the macro that we just created, printing out and making sure that we honor the margins, honor the print, and then printing it out. Okay. That's it. And also saving as a PDF. Again, we're going to set the file path of the string, right? We saw that previously when we save it as a PDF, it automatically creates a really cool PDF and it's automatically there. Nice PDF. We've got multiple pages on here. If we take a look, scrolling up here, we've got 3 pages. There's our footer, our last page, and our first page here. So we've got all the pages here. Really, really cool. And we're going to set, notice the name of it. It's called Dolores Richmond _1. So we've got the customer name, underscore, and the invoice automatically. So that's what we're going to do inside this macro. First thing what we're going to do, of course, is run the macro to make sure that we have that printer set up. I'm going to set this top margin at 35. That worked out quite well for this PDF. This one was 40 for the, so I want to make sure we could probably move this down here. Actually, I'm going to do it here. What I'd like to do is not set the page setup here. I want to do it right here, actually inside the print here, right here. That's probably better. So for the print, we're going to set it to 40. For the PDF, here we're going to set it to 35. I want to get a file path because we're going to need to save that PDF. I'm going to base it on the current path of the workbook here. I'm going to need a backslash, and then I want to set the customer name. That customer name is based on E4, an underscore, and also based on the invoice number, which is A1. That's going to get us our full file path. I want to make sure that if there's already a PDF inside with that exact name, we're going to remove it. So if directory, file path, VB directory does not equal empty, that means that there is a PDF that exists with that exact name. So and then we have to kill it and delete any existing, right? Delete any existing PDF with the same name. Okay, with the same name. With automatically creates end with. That's kind of cool, usually, but not always. That's 𝐼𝐒 that automates that. Okay, so next thing is simply exporting as a fixed format PDF. We can do that with invoice, export as fixed format, type PDF based on the file path. Okay, if we see the true and false, if we hit the comma, we'll understand what that means. Ignoring the print areas, false, certainly we don't want to ignore. We just spent a lot of work creating those print areas. And then also we want to make sure, in this case, I want to open after publish. If you don't want that PDF to open after we create this, we just put this to false. And that's automatically going to create this PDF. Wow, what an awesome training. I showed you how to create this very, very cool multi-page invoice with, of course, floating footers, dynamic headers, and of course, we're able to add taxes and customers, creating a very, very cool invoice. I hope you do like these trainings. There's so many ways to support us if you do like this training. Don't forget, we have a great 250 workbook template pack. Finally, it's now out. You can pick that up for a very, very low price. That's going to be available to you. I'll include the links down below. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, comment below, let me know your thoughts and ideas, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much.